We are in the book of Acts. We are in a long study through the book of Acts. And I will tell you what, even if it hasn't done anything for you, I have been just loving it. It has been so insightful, so exciting to dig into this. So thank you for letting me indulge myself, even if you're like, yeah, Patrick, you're having more fun than the rest of us. That's fine. We are flying through the book of Acts. If you are participating in the reading guide, which we still have copies of in the fellowship hall, we're in chapter 15. We're halfway there, living on a prayer. When you are reading through these stories, though, you do lose a little sense of time. You know what I mean? You're reading one paragraph and then the next paragraph, and you're like, did that happen the next day? Was that weeks? Was that months? So last week we talked about this supernatural prison break that Peter was a part of, that he experienced, and that story encouraged the church. And it's about 5 years later to the story that we're going to interact with today. It's about 5 years. This story of Jesus keeps spreading. It's magnetic. It's electric. And I think it is easy for us as followers of Jesus to lose sight of how compelling the gospel actually is. When you are not familiar with the concept, when you haven't heard that idea and someone explains the gospel in a way that you get, that you understand, something lights up inside you. And it's easy for us to forget that. And so I wanted to walk through, just really briefly, for us to maybe be able to recapture some of that excitement. Let's start with this way. We all know the experience of falling short of someone else's expectations, right? We all know what it's like to not make the team, to flop on an audition, to really do bad on a test. We all know that. Maybe I know that more than most people, but I know what that's like. I know the feeling of not meeting up to an external expectation. But the crazy thing is that we have often failed to meet our own expectations of ourselves. Not somebody else's, our own expectations of us. Like, I want to be an authentic person, but it's easy to project and be not pretentious, but to be pretentious, but just to show the world an inauthentic version of me. It's easy to do that because I think that this is what they will like, so I can project this version of me. Or it's easy we want to be kind, but man, everything makes us angry. Or we want to end unfair third world labor practices, but we really like cheap goods. You know, we fall short of our own expectations. And that's the internal battle that we wrestle with. Christianity says that sense of falling short is real. It doesn't try to manage it. It doesn't try to say, well, you just need to lower your standards. It doesn't try to say you just need to emphasize this area where you're really good and ignore this area where you're not so good. It says, yes, that falling short is real. Those internal expectations are an echo of divine expectations that we have fallen short of. That's real. That's a hard message. Nobody likes that, but that's part of what the gospel is. And Christianity teaches that you cannot manage it away. You can't blame, you can't excuse, you can't justify, you can't numb it away. Those things may help for a period, but they won't eliminate that sense of, man, my life is not in sync with the way it should be, with the way I want it to be, with the way that I know that I was created to be. And Christianity is the only major worldview, philosophy that addresses the reality of human brokenness. We are broke, some of us, but yeah, brokenness is probably a better way to say that. It's kind of like, have you ever had this experience where you go to the doctor and you know something's wrong, but you don't know what? That's why you go to the doctor. You want them to give you something or some concept or label or explanation of like, why do I feel this way? What is going on? And the doctor doesn't really listen to you. And they just prescribe something, and you're like, no, you're not actually hearing. There's something wrong, and I need a real solution. And I think that's what the gospel is. We know there's something wrong, and we need a real solution. And the gospel deals with that. And the good news is that Christianity says, yes, something is wrong. And Jesus addressed it. He addressed the past failure. He deals with the brokenness. He remakes you inside out. He gives you a new heart. He gives you a new mind. And he doesn't require you to jump through a bunch of hoops to get there. It's a humbling, it's an accepting of this reality. Jesus, resurrection, gospel. Like, this is the reality. And for people who have been living with that angst and that tension for so long, if someone comes along and explains there is a path of relief and new life and goodness, that is a compelling message. That is a compelling message. It's all summed up by the concept that you'll read throughout the scripture. You've heard it. It almost becomes a cliche, but to be saved by faith. That's what the gospel is. That's the good news. And that is the message that is taking hold in the first century through the book of Acts, that just keeps spreading from neighbor to neighbor, from coworker to coworker, from family to family. This thing is going global real fast because it is so compelling. People hear that and they're like, I want that for my life. I want that for my kids. I want that for my grandkids. That's the message. So last week, Acts chapter 12, we read about a prison break. Acts chapter 13 and 14, which was readings earlier this week, it centers on this specific church outside of Jerusalem in Antioch. In fact, historically, this is the church that these chapters are talking about, built into a side of a cave. I'm sure a lot of the work was done after the first century, but this is the specific church. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to imagine the ideal church. The ideal church. This is the church, this is the message of the gospel that is spilled beyond the borders of Jerusalem and Israel and is moving into new territory. So the primary population of this church are non-Jewish people. And Jewish people had a word for non-Jewish people. You know what it is? Oh, Gentile. We gotta do some work here. Gentile. Everybody that's not Jewish is Gentile, and this church was primarily Gentile. And this is going to start to be an issue. All right, this church is amazing. It's multicultural, it's multi-ethnic, the women are strong, the men are good-looking, the children are above average. If you lived in Antioch, you would have a sense, wow, I don't know what's going on, but what's going on there, I like. There's something attractive going on there. There's something happening there. It's like when Chick-fil-A first came to the cities. You had heard rumors of Chick-fil-A. People talked about this chicken sandwich, and you were like, it can't be that good. We have chicken. You can get a chicken sandwich at any fast food place. And they're like, you don't understand. It's chicken sandwich and politeness. It's chicken, and I think these people really love you. And so Chick-fil-A came actually right up the street from our house, and the drive-through was miles long because people were like, there's something happening at that corner. There's something real. There's something true. There's something good, and it's a chicken sandwich. In Antioch, people felt like that about this community that was centered around the person of Jesus and the life that he lived and the death that he died and the resurrection. And people thought there is something real and true and good, and it was attractive and it was growing. So just imagine the perfect church, the church you want to be a part of, the church that you would long to be in community with. And this is this church in Antioch. It's just this beautiful thing happening. Christians aren't just different than everybody else. It's good different. You know what I mean? It's substantial different. As I was thinking about this, the different you see in some people who are following Jesus is very hard to define. Sometimes we think it's like, well, maybe they dress a little differently, or they do their hair a little differently, or they're just like there's something different, but it's hard to define. And C.S. Lewis, in the very last chapter of his book, Mere Christianity, has this definition of good different that I think is excellent. Let me read just a short paragraph to you. He says, this is the good different that people who follow Jesus seem to exemplify. He said, they will not be very like your idea of religious people. They will not be Ned Flanders or Angela Martin from The Office. They do not draw attention to themselves. You think you're being kind to them when they're really being kind to you. They love you more than other people love you, but they need you less. They seem to have a lot of time, and you'll wonder where it comes from. They cross every border of color, sex, class, age. And he writes, to become a Christian is kind of like joining a secret society. And he says, to put it at its very lowest, it must be great fun. And this is C.S. Lewis trying to help people understand what is the difference here. And it's so hard to define because there's not a wardrobe style that exemplifies it. There's not a haircut. It's not like all Christians have to get this kind of job or this kind of house or do this. It's nothing like that. There's something more and deeper and more substantial to what it means to be this different kind of Christian. So imagine Jesus community, it is on fire. People are longing for what this thing has. And then you get this verse in Acts chapter 15, verse 1. Beautiful, growing, loving, awesome church, Acts 15:1. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Beautiful, wonderful, amazing, tremendous community. And then some people come along and say, what you have is pretty good. There's just a little extra you need to be doing. There's just a little more. And the men of the church of Antioch said, what's that now? Is that Jesus calling to say? Some of you are like, circumcision, I haven't come across this word. That's totally fine. It is a little surgery that was a sign of the covenant that God had established with Israel. There's a whole interesting, fascinating history behind it. This is not something that we dig into a lot, but it's very fascinating. We exchange rings when we get married, and God said, I want the guys to get surgeries. Let me just say this. If it was a way of indicating that you were all in on this relationship with God, okay? Now, Antioch, this city, this beautiful community, is about 300 miles away from Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet in elevation, and Antioch was about 300 feet in elevation. So you went downhill to go to Antioch. And that's what had happened. People, when they say they went down, even though it's north, they went down the hill to go talk to these people at Antioch and say, we love what's going on here with all this Jesus stuff. We just also need you to have a little surgery and make sure you keep the law of Moses. Well, verse 2, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. I love that the translators translated it sharp dispute. I think that seems like a pretty good pun. Now, I wish that's what the original language said, but that's not. The sharp dispute is literally riot. And I think a translator going from Greek to English was like, I got just the word here for this. That's what I think happened. But it was a riot. So in other words, it was threatening to disrupt this community, this additional teaching that they were being asked to observe. Sharp dispute. So it's not a minor problem, essentially. It was threatening the life of this young, beautiful community. And this is true. This is true. You've experienced this kind of thing. Anytime the church makes a change, adapts to better spread the gospel in the environment and the context in which that particular church is in, it creates turbulence. Anytime. Anytime the church grows and things shift and change, it creates turbulence because people worry that any change risks letting go of something important. And that can be true. There can be elements of the gospel that are minimized or shifted in order to encourage more people to participate. And that, of course, would be wrong. But also, and this is really important, if a church never changes, it also risks something crucial and important, and that is actual life and health and growth. If it never changes. And this is why. This is so hard for people to wrap their minds around because anytime there's any change, it could be even small changes. People are like, I don't know. We used to have that color of carpet, and I think that's what Jesus would have wanted. You got that new carpet. I don't know if Jesus is going to come to church here anymore. How about this? Let me give you maybe a safe example. How many of you can feel this picture right here? How many of you can feel that picture? You know what I mean? You grew up in a church like this that had pews, and you're like, oh yeah, for years I thought I had back problems. Turns out it was just sitting on one of these every Sunday, and the preacher would just go too long. Pews were not made for comfort. Nobody looks at these and says, oh, that looks relaxing. I'd love to sit down and watch a movie on one of those. And this is what's wrong with the church today, right? We're too comfortable. We got these cushy chairs that we're sitting on. We need to go back to these. And I guarantee you, when churches moved away from pews, there were people that made that argument. People are going to fall asleep. They're not going to listen to the sermon. It's too comfortable. You need to make it, following Jesus is suffering. So let's just create an environment of suffering. Life is full of suffering. Why should the church be any different? Now, if you went to a soft liberal church, you probably had these. Do you remember those? These were incredible for your core strength because some sweet sister in the church sewed these. These are aftermarket. They didn't come standard. They sewed these, and they slip off the front as you sit down, and so you've got to be constantly working your core to stay upright. And so people who go to churches like these have great abs. Churches, I don't know why we kept pews long after there were better options available. I was trying to think of where do you still come across pews? Maybe courtrooms and churches. That's all that's really left. But in fact, contrast that with these cushy things that you're sitting in, right? We debated between the 2-inch padding and the 4-inch padding on these seats. Should we get 2-inch? Should we get 4-inch? And the elders were like, hey, if we get 2-inch, you have to shave about 10 minutes off your sermon. So it's up to you. And so I went with the 4-inch. And so I'm going to preach for an hour today. That's not true. They didn't tell me that. I'm just joking. But I could give you dozens of even just minor examples that churches made adaptations to better serve their communities, and people got frustrated by it because they were concerned that we were letting go of something that mattered and something substantial. And there's so many examples, but by the way, I know this is going to happen to me too. It's going to happen to all of us. Someday far in the future, when I'm actually old, the kids are going to come to me and they're going to be like, Patrick, we want to do laser worship or hologram preaching, or I don't know what the thing will be. We want to do that. And I'll be like, oh, the good old days when we had PowerPoint and projectors and all that. But I hope that I'm always willing to elevate the gospel over those preferences so that more people can find their way to Jesus. And I hope that's the kind of church that we are. There is a constant danger that in the pursuit of comfort and familiarity and tradition, that we elevate those things over the gospel. There's a constant danger of that. And that is the danger facing this church in Antioch. Beautiful community. By the way, you also need to circumcise and keep the law of Moses. And just for the sake of conversation, the concept of circumcision came to embody keeping the law of Moses. So they'd be like, well, if they're going to go as far as doing that, then they're going to do all the other things as well. So they didn't always define it like you got to do all these things, but they just kind of talked about it in this one word, this one concept of circumcision. By the way, have you ever thought about this? That if you've grown up in church, if you've been around church for a long time, the thing that you love as a tradition was once an innovation. You know, some of you are like, why don't we have the hymn books anymore? I just wish we had the hymn books. That was an innovation at one point. There weren't hymn books. You had to memorize all the lyrics to everything or pretend you knew, right? Everything's an innovation at some point. This is the danger facing the church in Antioch. All right, now this is you may not care about the details of this debate, but I think that they matter because the debate of should we circumcise people who are not Jewish or not casts a long shadow over the New Testament. You cannot read the epistles of Paul and not come across the concept. Certainly in the book of Romans, book of 1 Corinthians, and it's all over the book of Galatians. It emphasizes this idea because this was an ongoing debate among these new churches, these new Jesus communities that were popping up all over. So you have to understand the debate. And there's an important lesson at the heart of this. And actually, I love debates too. So I want to just share with you what the debate was. All right? So in this corner, you literally have what Paul calls the circumcision party. It is not a party I would go to. Not a party I would join politically. But that's what Paul calls it. He calls it the party of the circumcision. And what they taught is they're like, listen, guys, there's 2,000 years of history behind this. It goes all the way back to Abraham. He was our forefather in the faith. You cannot go changing things up now. There is 2 millennia of history behind this. And by the way, it's the sign of the covenant. How is God going to know who's in and who's out unless we have the surgery? That's what God taught all the way back at the time of Abraham. And they would say God literally commanded circumcision. There are verses, there are lots of verses in the Old Testament, specifically verses like Genesis 17, 10 through 12, where God's like very serious about commanding it. And so they came to this church in Antioch full of Gentiles and they said, here's what you need to do and here's why. Here's why. Now, remember, Paul and Barnabas were in sharp dispute and debate with them, and here's what they would say. They would say, yeah, those 2,000 years, that was all pointing to Jesus. That was all waiting for Jesus. And now we have Jesus here. We're not waiting anymore. Those 2,000 years were all just building up to Jesus coming. They would say, yeah, absolutely. It's a sign of the covenant. It's a sign of the old covenant. But Jesus established a new covenant. And he talked about his death and burial and resurrection as being the sign of the new covenant. So yeah, it was, but it isn't anymore. And then they would also argue that Jesus uncommanded circumcision by proving that Gentiles were now accepted and righteous before God without that surgery. So that's the debate. And by the way, this is a little side topic, but if you continue reading in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 16, Paul encourages one of the people in his posse, one of his mentees, to get circumcised, a Gentile guy, to get circumcised, not to cause waves. He didn't think it was wrong to do it. He thought it was wrong to require it, to try to communicate to people that you cannot be saved, that God doesn't love you, that he doesn't accept you unless you do these things. So Paul and Barnabas were saying, hey, listen, Jesus made some updates. So this group was saying the emphasis is on the law and obedience to the law and law keeping. And this group was saying the emphasis is on Jesus. That's what it's all about. That's the debate. And they would argue, I think, very, very, they wouldn't use these terms, but I think they would argue like, how many of you still hold on to some old defunct technology just in case it ever makes a comeback? You know, some of you are like, 8-tracks, man, I got a whole closet of them, and if that ever gets cool again, I'm going to be the coolest guy on the block, you know? Or let me tell you, you can take those laser discs right to Goodwill. That technology is not coming back. It's old, it's outdated, it's done for. I know we loved it, and we spent a lot of money on that collection, but go ahead and give it away. Send it to the Smithsonian. Maybe they'll have a display for it. Maybe a better analogy for the shift from the old covenant to the new covenant is not, we should never imply that the old covenant is wrong or bad, or it's not that at all. The old covenant got humans to a place where Jesus came along and finished the job. So, for example, how many of you have ever had a long-distance relationship, romantic relationship with someone? And it was mediated through a technology like FaceTime, right? You would get on FaceTime or cell phone call, or back in the day it was a landline, and you were spending like $50 a night calling this person who lived long distance. And you can't believe long distance is free now, and it is, and that's just the way the world is. You had this relationship that was mediated through this particular technology. But then you got married and you moved in together. It would be weird to continue to have your relationship through FaceTime. If you're both sitting in the living room together on FaceTime with each other, that would be weird. And you're like, yeah, but the kids all do it. They text each other. Doesn't matter. It still would be weird. I know some couples still FaceTime one another. You know, if you're in the basement and he's upstairs, or if you're in the bathroom out of toilet paper and you need someone, you know. I get that. That still happens. That old way was good because it got us to a place where we could be together, and that's the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant. It's not bad. We're not saying it's wrong. We're just saying Jesus has inaugurated a new way to be together. So you can see why this is a big debate. There's a lot at stake. Acts chapter 15, verse 2. Second part of verse 2. Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to climb back up the hill to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. This is splitting the church apart. So they've got to go to the guys who know and get some answers. So the church in Jerusalem is where the heavyweights were. Peter was there. James, the brother of Jesus, were there. Elders were there. Other apostles were there. It's the I'm going to get mom sibling conflict. We're going to bring in the authority and get a final answer. This is the spiritual Supreme Court. If anyone can crack the case, it's these guys. Jump down to verse 6. The apostles and elders met to consider this question. Because remember, up to this point, everybody in the church had been Jewish. There hadn't been a reason to debate this because everybody kept the law. Everybody got circumcised. Everybody did all the things. There weren't any hot dogs at fellowship meals. It was all normal. Everybody had the same cultural expectations. But now you're bringing in these non-Jewish people, and things are starting to get shaken up a little bit. Verse 6, the apostles and elders met to consider this question after much discussion. And that phrase, after much discussion, is doing a lot of work because these guys loved debates. Not just these church guys, but you can go back and read some of the rabbinical debates throughout Hebrew history, and they would debate for months, for years, sometimes about these little details. There's this great debate between these two schools of thought that debated for a long time over whether or not it was okay to tell an ugly woman she was beautiful on her wedding day. They debated that. And one group said, no, that would be a lie. If she's ugly, just don't say anything, right? And the other school of thought, I'm not kidding, there are historical documents that reference this debate. The other school of thought was, listen, every bride is beautiful in her own way, and you need to tell her she's beautiful. And you know which side won out? The side that said, just tell them they're beautiful, which I'm glad. I think that's the right one. I think that's the good one to have one out. I'm just telling you, these debates were like sporting events. You could probably sell concessions and eat popcorn. I would have loved this era of just getting into it with people. So they love this stuff. And they make three arguments. And I know this feels like, man, we're really getting into the weeds here, but this is so important to understand how they understood what it was to shift from this way of being that had been around for 2,000 years to this new thing, this uncomfortable new thing. So we have to understand how they did it. There's three basic arguments. These are genius arguments. They're so good. They're so interesting. The first is, we saw it. We witnessed it. We are eyewitnesses. Look at what they say. Peter says in Acts chapter 15, second half of verse 7. Peter got up and he addressed this crowd that had gathered to hear the debate. And he said, brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. So Peter's saying, I preach to people. And he says, God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving them the Holy Spirit. Just as he did to us, he did not discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Peter's just saying, I saw it. I saw it firsthand. I saw God accept people without the surgery, without keeping the law. I saw it. That's good. That's eyewitness testimony is pretty important. Secondly, Peter makes this argument, and this is so good. He says, we broke the law. This is really good. Look at what he says in Acts 15:10. He says, now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors for 2 millennia have been able to keep or bear? He goes, no, we believe it's through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved just as they are. So this is the basic argument. Peter, I imagine he's got this crowd of people. They're all sitting on their edge of their seats trying to figure out, do we circumcise, do we not? And Peter goes to one of them and he's like, Jebediah, have you ever broken the law? Have you ever broken the law, Jebediah? And Jebediah has to admit, well, yeah, I have. I've broken the law. And so he's like, Jebediah, have your grandparents ever broken the law? Well, yeah, my grandparents have broken the law. And so Peter's saying, if you or your grandparents can't keep the law perfectly, that means you are saved by grace, not by law keeping. And if you're saved by grace, so are these Gentiles, not by law keeping. Isn't that a good argument? You're like, ooh, Peter, sneaky smart. That's really good. We broke the law. God saved us by grace. And then the third one, this is, I know Peter probably dropped the mic right there, but there's a third argument, and I think this is really interesting to read. James, the brother of Jesus, very fascinating, he gets up and he says, when you actually read what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, if you actually read it, it actually says Gentiles are going to be part of this thing over and over and over again. It says it over and over again. Look at what he quotes Amos, Acts chapter 15, verse 17. This is a reference to Amos. He says that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord. Who does these things? Things known from long ago. And James is just saying, it's actually been here all along. We were just primed not to see it. If you've grown up in the church, particularly if you've grown up in certain kinds of church environments, you've heard certain verses over and over and over again, and you thought, well, I read it, that's what that means. I've heard it preached, that's what it means. And then there is one time where someone explains it just a little differently, and it kind of unlocks this new reality outside of that verse. It's because so much of what we understand about Scripture, we are primed to understand that way. But sometimes if you can just block everything out and just take it in, it reads very differently. I could give you plenty of examples, and feel free to come talk to me. Just things that we always thought meant one thing, but because we were only primed to hear them that way. All right, as we wrap up, I want you to notice two things through this debate. And you're kind of like, wow, this is a whole sermon about some ancient debate that doesn't even apply to me. But it does. Let me draw out the principles that we need to hear. Two things. Number one, this is important. It mattered that they got this right, and it mattered that they got it right together. I think most of us would have said, I disagree with them, so I'm leaving that church. Or we would have said, I disagree, so I'm splitting that church. If you've been around churches, you've seen, oh, there used to be one, and now there are two churches, but it's just two small churches, half the size of the old church. Church split. And they split over mostly dumb things. It mattered that they got it right, and they got it right together. They didn't say, you know what, you do you. You live your own truth. You just, whatever is true for you, you do. No, truth matters. What the church is going to teach matters. How the church is going to draw people in and what we communicate to the world, that deeply matters. It mattered that they got it right. And it was hard, painful work to come up with this together. They had to walk 300 miles uphill to get the answer. Imagine every debate, every disagreement you had with somebody at church, even here. You were like, yeah, we could get the answer, but we have to walk 300 miles uphill to get the answer. Would you be like, I'm good. I'm fine. I don't really need to know that bad. No, you need to know that bad. Unity matters. Truth matters. It matters. But the second thing I think is really important, because I want you to notice the specific value that the church elevated in order to draw out the principle. Verse 19, I think this is so important. Verse 19, James, brother of Jesus, gets up and he says, it is my judgment. This is the conclusion. This is the Supreme Court submitting their opinion. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to the Lord. There is no need to set up any more hurdles in anybody's way. It would be crazy to say, hey, come to Jesus, but you have to have a surgery first. That's what James is saying. We should not make it difficult. I think, church, that we should have this verse etched on our hearts. Etched on our hearts. I think we have no right to adapt or change the Scripture, but I think for our purposes, we're mostly all Gentiles in here. I think we would say it more like this. It is our judgment, therefore we should not make it difficult for anyone who is turning to God. Anyone who is turning to God. Obviously, we never compromise the gospel, but is there anything we do as a matter of preference, of comfort, of tradition, that might make it hard for someone else to find Jesus here? If there is, that thing is in the way, that thing is wrong. Not just indifferent, wrong. We never compromise the gospel, but everything else should be up for debate. Everything else. When we talk about our mission statement, helping every person take their next step closer to Jesus, the reality is that some things, it's not just helping them take their next step, it's clearing things out of the way so that they can take their next step. And I think that this is for us Christians, this is a truth for us. I think that we need to really be thoughtful and honest. What might be in the way? Something that I love, something that I value, something that I cherish, something that's meaningful to me, but it's in the way. It's in the way. I'm going to ask our praise team to come up, and we're going to close out with a song together, a song called Graves into Gardens, which I think is another beautiful sentiment, but just expressing what it means to turn lives around or see lives turned around, to see something go from ugly to beautiful, to see someone's life go from tragic to wonderful. And that's what we want to encourage. That's what we want to be a part of. So let's stand together and sing as we close out.